I'd like to start with a few questions just to set the stage around workplace mental health. So we'll start with Arianna. So after your own personal experience with stress and burnout, you made a mission out of popularizing the issue in corporate culture. What can we learn from the traction you've gained there that can be applied to addressing diagnosable mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder?
First of all, Kelly, I want to thank you for your bravery, for coming forward, and through your own story, helping, I know it's going to be millions of people, to be able to address a condition that is so prevalent and takes so many forms, and that we are finally talking about. So thank you very much for what you're doing and for bringing us all together here. And we are really excited about launching this section, and I hope you're all going to contribute and make it a hub for this very important conversation. My own story is kind of typical of some of the conditions that are very, very prevalent in what's happening with people's mental health. And these are the conditions of stress and burnout in workplaces. So we now know that stress and burnout, which includes sleep deprivation, being always on, growing addiction to our devices, are very, very fundamental to what leads to depression, anxiety, and a lot of the conditions that we're discussing here today. In my case, it was 2007, 2 years into building the Huffington Post and being a divorced mother of 2 teenage daughters. Anybody here has teenage daughters? My deep sympathies, and it gets better, but it's not easy. I just basically had bought into the prevailing delusion that in order to succeed and be the perfect mom and entrepreneur, you just have to be always on and sacrifice your own well-being. And I ended up collapsing. Literally, I got up from my desk, hit my head on the way down, broke my cheekbone, and as I came to in a pool of blood, and nobody had shot me, and ironically, I had just been put on the Time 100 list, I had to ask myself, is this what success looks like? So that really for me was the beginning of looking around and seeing that burnout and stress are global epidemics, and seeing the connection with mental health. And what is interesting and makes our conversation so timely is that 2017 was the year of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening has just happened. Many people, like Stephen, have been really toiling in this field for many years, but I hope you realize now how suddenly people have woken up to the fact that mental health conditions are as prevalent as physical health conditions. And also that, leaving aside, genetic conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, the more garden variety depression and anxiety that we are talking about, and that can actually lead to suicides and completely debilitating conditions, are very, very connected with stress and burnout, and which are very fixable. So that's what my passion, like Kelly's, led me to leave the Huffington Post and devote 100% of my time into these issues by launching Thrive Global and working with corporations to fix their cultures, as well as directly with consumers through our media platform.
Thank you, Arianna. I really appreciate you sharing the personal story. So Steve, as a stigma expert and as an expert in the field, I'm curious if you could tell us why people with mental health conditions can't just tough it out.
Let's see, this will be this morning's lecture, and then we'll come back afternoon for part 2. This is the huge issue. So stigma is a Greek word, most psychological and psychiatric terms are. And what did it literally mean back at the Agora in Athens? Maybe it was important that you knew who was a slave or a traitor, who had fought for Sparta. So a brand was burned into your skin underneath the toga. Everybody knew. There's still physical branding. Hitler branded people in the camps who included not only Jewish people, but people with mental infirmities. Some nations branded HIV positive individuals in the 80s. Most stigma today is psychological, it's inferred rather than a physical mark. Mental health issues remain at the top, or however you consider it, the bottom of the list. Homelessness, substance abuse, and mental health issues receive the most stigma. Left-handedness used to be highly stigmatized. And today, if you're left-handed, you've got good spatial abilities and go to MIT and it's awesome. Things have really changed. We hope that things can change for mental health, but we know as a society tons more about alcoholism, substance abuse, mental health issues than in the 50s, but stigma has actually increased since that time. Attitudes have worsened despite our greater knowledge. Mental health issues, including those with a high genetic predisposition, as Arianna just mentioned, as well as more common anxiety and depression, those have a genetic predisposition as well. But even for bipolar illness, it depends on the environment as to how that illness will be expressed. It's always genes and environments working together. When you cross a certain threshold, it's not animal spirits as we used to think, it's not weak personal will or poor moral fiber, it's a combination, like heart disease or cancer, of inborn proclivities, environmental toxins, and how you cope with stress that can cross the threshold into mental illness. It's not just toughing it out, but all of us think we know that, of course, I've been sad too, why can't you snap out of it? What do you mean anxious? You can go up to the second or third floor. We all fend off some of our own vulnerabilities, and that kind of projection outward leads to the high rates of stigma. I got into this because of what would seem like a very idyllic childhood back in the Midwest. My father was a philosopher. My mom taught English at Ohio State. Dad would disappear for months, even a year at a time, into some of the country's worst mental hospitals with misdiagnosed schizophrenia. His doctors told him that if my little sister and I ever learned the reason for his disappearances, we'd be permanently destroyed, so my mom and dad were forbidden from ever mentioning the topic. Would an oncologist today tell a dad, don't tell your children about your cancer, it'll permanently destroy them? But remember, cancer wasn't put in your obituary in the 30s and 40s. It was a weakness of will. You brought it on yourself. We've got to up the understanding that we're all in a number of continua and spectra. When we cross over into mental health issues, we need access to treatment. We need accommodations in the workplace that makes everybody get better. So stigma and mental health issues are beyond just toughing it out. It's a matter of getting support, being able to disclose, as you did a couple of years ago, and getting society on the side of, it's not them, it's us. It's our children, it's our parents, it's our colleagues, it's ourselves, about 1 in 4 in any given year.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that perspective. Becky, I wanted to ask you, why is addressing these conditions a company's responsibility, and where is the line between personal and professional?
Thank you. I mean, it's an imperative that we address these issues. We, like for myself included, it's the idea or the thought that we can compartmentalize our personal lives and our professional lives is just a total fallacy. Employees bring their whole self to work every day, and we just need to be prepared to help them thrive and succeed in the workplace. We just don't have the luxury, and it's actually quite dangerous to think about the idea that they're going to leave everything that happens outside of work at home and just come prepared to work every single day. At SurveyMonkey, we recently did a survey with Thrive and Glamour magazine, and it showed that 25% of our respondents or employees expressed that mental health struggles had affected their performance at work. And they also felt that up to 20% of their coworkers or even their bosses had experienced performance-related issues or a lack of career development associated with their mental health struggles. So this is a very real phenomenon, as if we needed any more evidence in that category, right? So we need to think proactively about employees as a whole person. We need to think about programs, benefits, and offerings to help them integrate their work and their life in the way that they can be productive at work, but also responsible for all of the things they have going on outside of work. And really, one of the most important things is we need both managers and leaders and or HR professionals to be able to engage in judgment-free conversations about mental health struggles or issues at work. That same survey that I referred to earlier also had some staggering facts about how people feel about being able to deal with things at work. Roughly a mere 4% of respondents said that they felt comfortable having a conversation at work with their leader or manager about their mental health struggles. 4% of people. And roughly, over 30% of people said that they felt like they had any support at all at work to address these issues. And we know what happens when employees don't feel well supported or have a channel or outlet to discuss things at work, as they leave and they move on and take their talents elsewhere. So we just don't have the luxury of pretending like it doesn't exist or it doesn't come into the workplace.
Thank you so much, Becky. I really love that, the judgment-free conversation. I wrote that down. I think that would have helped me a lot if I could have had some judgment-free conversation several years ago. So I'd like to shift gears to the increasing urgency of this issue. And this question is for anyone who would like to answer. So in addition to being a moral issue, companies lose about $17 billion annually because of mental health related productivity issues. So I'm curious why you think now is the time to address this issue, both morally and from a business lens.
I'll start because I've got the mic first. The mental health crisis is real and awareness has surged and broken the barrier. The leading cause of death around the world, first world, second world, third world, for girls 15 to 19 and women 20 to 24 is suicide. The leading cause of death. The estimated cost of mental health conditions for the worldwide economy was $1 trillion last year. Suicide rates are rising in older adults as well. Anxiety has become pandemic at Cal, where I teach. It's a badge of courage to say how stressed you are. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Triple Bind, Saving Our Teenage Girls from Today's Pressures. And for girls in particular, being nurturing and compassionate and super competitive athletically and academically, and doing it effortlessly and looking hot while doing so is physically and psychologically impossible. But that's the standard. That's what causes burnout, even in your teen years, much less as a career worker. The world economists now realize that mental health, if you put the conditions together, is the leading cause of disability. More than cancer, more than heart disease, more than pulmonary disease, diabetes, etc. It's time that we all thrive rather than shoveling it under the carpet, pretending it doesn't exist. Otherwise, we're doomed.
So I think what is also very important is to recognize that we can move upstream. We talk a lot about giving permission to everyone to talk about it at work, recognizing signs of it, co-workers being supportive of that, and all that is incredibly important. At Thrive, we are focusing on what we call going upstream, preventing the conditions that lead to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems, because they are preventable. And for me, the saddest thing, as a journalist, as someone who went into journalism because I wanted to do everything I could to alleviate suffering, there are so many areas where it's hard to alleviate suffering. Refugees, homelessness, we all can try and do everything we can, and it's hard. But this is suffering based on a false belief. Like if we stop believing something that is scientifically false, we will end a large part of this mental health suffering. And the delusion that we profoundly believe as a culture is that burnout is the price we pay for success. It's exactly what Steve said. Being able to be great at work, looking hot while you're doing everything and doing it effortlessly, that's kind of that's the burden that we put on the shoulders of our children and ourselves, and that has to end. 75% of all healthcare conditions are stress-related and preventable. So that means changing workplaces, changing expectations, making it clear that people are not expected to be on 24/7. Learning to build teams so that even if you are in a 24/7 company, which most companies increasingly are, that doesn't mean that a particular individual has to be available 24/7. And the additional problem now is the growing addiction to smartphones and social media and games. In China, they're beginning to call it the lost generation. The people who are so addicted to games, they're really losing empathy, they're losing passion for anything except playing the game. Here, we see our self-validation, especially the self-validation of teenagers, being now based on how many likes the picture of their salad or their bikini-clad body got. And this competitiveness, this comparing of your own inner life to somebody else's highlight reel, which is completely untrue and unreal, as we know when you scratch the surface, all that means that this conversation has become all the more urgent. And I just want to say it, I'm going to say it many times, Kelly, thank you for bringing us together to have this conversation and then to go back to our workplaces and make changes.
Yeah, so I would just add that we have so many validation points. I mean, in addition to everything that they're talking about the effect on businesses here. So whether it's the attrition and like what we're seeing in terms of industry attrition as high as its highest rates ever, 20%. Unemployment rates being really, really low and people have a tremendous amount of options. We do need to get ahead of this and not only be thoughtful about our workplace experiences and our programming at work and the offerings that we have for our employees, but also in thinking about how do we identify hotspots within our organizations to better understand what's going on with our employees. So one of the things that we've done at SurveyMonkey is we think of our relationship with our employees as an ongoing dialogue, just like your marriage, your relationship with children. You can't check in once a year and believe that you have a true understanding of your team and your people, what's top of mind for them, what's working well, what's not working well, what's leading to stress, what's contributing positively to their work experience. It has to be an ongoing dialogue if it's going to be meaningful. So we've developed a business solution called SurveyMonkey Engage. And while we've been measuring employee engagement, belonging and inclusion, and getting a good sense of how employees feel in terms of their day-to-day experience, this is a more purpose-built solution that allows us to do it on an ongoing and regular cadence and asking our employees thoughtful questions about their experience overall, but more importantly, things like their sense of belonging, their sense of inclusion in the workplace, whether or not they feel like they have channels to share their concerns or bring their concerns up, and if those concerns are addressed to their satisfaction. So it's a means or a way for us to not only get insights and data that help us be more proactive and thoughtful, but also to have a real pulse of what's going on in our organization so that we can understand and sense where we have growing issues and concerns from employees.
I just want to add something apropos of what Kelly said in her introduction, which is that one of the reasons that led to her anxiety becoming worse was the fact that she was missing her weekly appointment, her weekly therapy appointment. That is incredibly significant. So what we are recommending to all the companies we're working with and we're practicing at Thrive is what we call the entry interview. And we have exit interviews. I think we should be having entry interviews. And the first question in the entry interview is, what is important to you outside work? And there are people who say things like, my physical therapy appointment is important to me, or my taking my daughter to school at 7:30 every morning is important to me. So putting these things on the table so the manager knows and can make allowances for it, changes the experience of the person, including when it comes to the things that particularly stress them or bring joy to their lives, like taking your kid to school, which then counterbalance other elements that could lead to depression or anxiety. Sort of, as Steve said, it's all interconnected. It's not like you can separate things in little carefully designed compartments. So I love that story, Kelly. You should be repeating it because often it shows how big problems start with very small things that we are neglecting in what we need to function and work and live with our fullest.
Thank you, everyone. Want to shift a little bit and ask Arianna. So we've seen countries like Canada, Australia, and the UK prioritize workplace mental health movements. And in fact, some of those countries actually have laws requiring mental health trainings for managers, similar to how we have required sexual harassment trainings for managers in the US. So I'm curious why you think the US is behind.
First of all, I'm really surprised that the UK, which was my adopted home for a long time, is ahead of us, because I always thought they were unbelievably reserved and not talking about anything important. I think a lot of it actually there has to do with a few leaders who have stepped forward and talked about their stories, like Antonio Horta Osorio, the CEO of Lloyd's, who came out about his own mental health problems and has made Lloyd's banking the last place anybody would imagine a real model of workplace conditions around mental health. And what I love about everything he has said and done is how he is connecting them to burnout and stress conditions. They've done surveys, they've done focus groups, and again, sleep deprivation, for example, emerges as a number one cause of mental health problems. And I want to underline that, not just because I've written a book on sleep, but because it's the most neglected of the three pillars of health. Nutrition and exercise. We've been hearing and reading tons about for years, but sleep has been dismissed until very recently. So I think that what's happening in the US, and the reason why we're lagging behind, is this macho expectation of being always on, wearing like a badge of honor the fact that you don't sleep. I'll sleep when I'm dead, or you snooze, you lose. I mean, look at the language we use. And the fact that we use language of being overwhelmed as a badge of honor. How many times don't you hear people, I hear myself saying it and I stop myself, I'm swamped. I'll get back to you when I come up for air. I'm drowning, all these ways of talking about our lives, which are really sad if you think of it, that our lives are just reduced to a series of to-do lists and us breathlessly trying to cross things off the lists.
It's a problem when you add some things to the to-do list so you can make sure you've crossed them out, just so you feel good about yourself. I'm going to digress for a moment. I grew up in the Midwest. I played high school football. Our teams were state champions all 3 years. We never lost a game. Not much thanks to me, but at least I played. And our coach said, you don't get water during practice, and you do 2-a-days for 4 weeks before. It's that macho attitude that's how you succeed, and that's how you become state champions, as opposed to the preventive upstream approach that Arianna is hammering on. Everybody wins if you feel supported. Everybody wins if we realize that life doesn't work in the way of checklists or macho culture. I want to mention the ADA. Maybe you're going to ask about this, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which will have its 28th anniversary this summer. George Bush I signed it into law in the summer of 1990. It's illegal to discriminate in public or the workplace against people with physical or mental disabilities. The catch is you have to disclose that you have a mental disability. Physical disabilities are harder to hide. Until very recently, the vast majority of suits brought up under ADA, over 90%, were from people who needed a wider bathroom door or a ramp. People were too ashamed to bring up mental health issues, but the accommodations are inexpensive. Flex time. Get to your shrink. Get to your therapist. Work an hour later so you can have the hour earlier to drive your kid to school. The paradox is that the solutions are being denied because of the shame and stigma when they wouldn't be that hard to implement if you really thought about it.
That's the perfect segue, Steve, into a follow-up question I wanted to ask you. So we at Mindshare Partners know from our peer groups that people will go to great lengths to hide their mental health conditions, especially at work, given the stigma that you mentioned. So I'm curious how you think about how businesses could get around that strong stigma to be able to help and support employees, and then how leaders and executives with mental health conditions can lead by example and start to disclose.
One solution is everybody wears a sandwich board all day. I've got bipolar disorder, everybody knows. Probably not the way to do it. Disclosure is a matter of timing and rehearsal and support. Maybe you're not going to get the job if you disclose in the interview, but once you get the job, the entry interview becomes mandatory. Maybe if the company's big enough to have HR, and we get as progressive as some of our sister countries, we take into account employees' proclivities and needs and desires, design more productive workplaces around. What the default cannot be is, you can never mention this, which was the doctor's orders for my family. I grew up not knowing whether my dad was alive or dead. The only reason our family stayed together was that he got tenure at age 29 as a brilliant philosopher. Any other job he would have been fired from, with pretty outrageous bipolar episodes, which you can read about in the book, Another Kind of Madness. Another Kind of Madness is a quote from one of James Baldwin's masterpieces, Giovanni's Room. And from my perspective, another kind of madness is stigma and shame, which is worse than any form of mental illness itself, because it means we don't get treatment and we keep denying. If we change the culture even slightly to encourage disclosure, encourage support, the range of conditions upstream won't intensify, and those with more moderate to serious mental health conditions will get the treatment they need. The paradox of paradoxes is mental health treatments, whether it's medication or therapy or family support, work better on average than the treatment you get from your doctor for physical health conditions. We don't have cures yet, but the denial and shame perpetuate the lack of seeking treatment. 2006 study from Harvard School of Public Health. What's the average length of time for an adult in the US to notice he or she has symptoms of anxiety, depression, bipolar, ADHD, etc., and getting help? 11 years. And for things like OCD, it was more like 17 years. Wow. Those are a lot of lost years because of what we're talking about.
Thank you. We also find, and I think this is good for folks in the audience to know, that not everyone obviously has a mental health condition that is in a manager role. However, one thing we've seen at Mindshare is that it's helpful to share vulnerabilities and share struggles with your direct reports, and just even in doing that and showing that you're a human and that you do have challenges really opens the door for other people to share what they're going through. So Becky, I want to turn to you, and increasingly mental health is seen as a diversity and inclusion issue, as you were alluding to earlier, and not solely a compliance responsibility of HR. And so I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about what SurveyMonkey is doing to address mental wellness at work, and also how you think about approaching it from a benefits perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, so exactly right. We understand through our research that underrepresented groups, mental health struggles can be even more amplified or intensified for people in underrepresented groups. In one study that we did, we found that across all employees, not just those of underrepresented groups, but 67% of people articulate the connection or the impact on their own self-identity about the company that they're affiliated with. And when you ask that same question of women in STEM, for example, that increases to 77%. Of the respondents indicate that the company they work for is so closely tied to their self-identity. So, we find, again, all of this research demonstrates, well, that's kind of one example of where underrepresented groups, the impact is more magnified. It amplifies from there for various other underrepresented groups. So one of the things that we're doing at SurveyMonkey in partnership with Stanford is we've developed, again, another survey, a belonging and inclusion survey that we've deployed inside of SurveyMonkey for our first time, but are also working really hard to prepare it to share with other organizations so that they can deploy similar surveys in an effort, again, to understand and get ahead of these issues at work. And amongst many other things that it measures, it does measure things like people's overall sense of belonging and their belonging uncertainty. So it really gives you a pulse of how people are feeling, if they're feeling a true sense of inclusion, if they're feeling a sense of identity threat in your workplace. And you can look at the data by the individual demographics. You can see how you report for women and for other underrepresented groups to better understand what's going on and think of more thoughtful programs at work that can help individuals in those groups find their voice, have access to mentorship and leaders, or again, have channels to share their feelings of concerns at work.
Thank you so much, and SurveyMonkey is clearly true to its mission in all of your surveys. It's fantastic. So I wanted to just ask a final question to everyone. So a giant telecom company called Bell Canada has committed $100 million to workplace mental health to promote awareness throughout Canada. So I'm curious what each of you think might be the US company or collection of companies that should or could lead like that in the US, and what that might look like.
I'm going to duck the question. I'm a clinical and developmental psychologist and say the wave of the future is young people. In 2001, what percentage of Americans were in favor of gay marriage? 38%. In 2016, that had gone up to 62%. And if you look at the Pew data every year, this is driven by people under 25. As I said a few minutes ago, mental health stigma has hardly budged in the last 60 years. But we're working with high school kids now, forming clubs, not mental health groups. Let's erase the stigma clubs under the group Bring Change to Mind. chess club, Latin club, I guess there's still Latin clubs, rugby club, the Let's Club. Some schools have 100 members, and these kids design their own curricula, bringing in speakers, raising awareness to change attitudes. I think in 40 or 50 years, that's going to move the dial, because they're going to be the CEOs and professors and entrepreneurs of the future. I think young people is a huge way to go to end this centuries-long censuring of people with mental health issues. So I'm going to put in a plug for building across generations and starting young as we move forward.
So I actually am more impatient than Steve. And I believe this is something that can be resolved much faster if we do two things. One, if we hear more from everybody. So these clubs that you mentioned, this is fantastic. We would love to be connected and invite them, Kelly and I, to write for our section. And when we say write for the section, the truth is that they probably are already writing. They're already putting stuff on their Facebook walls, they're already posting things maybe on the college sites. We see our section as simply amplifying work people are already doing. Amazing work is already being done. I mean, your surveys, we need to have them all on the site. Everything, anybody you know, of course, everybody in the room, but also everybody you know, just invite them to cross-post things. It's not even just about doing new work, it's about amplifying existing expressions so that we can come together, and by amplifying it, we're going to reach a critical mass faster. And once we reach a critical mass, magical things happen. I mean, it was kind of incredible. You mentioned gay marriage. It was literally from one year to the next. We went from Barack Obama saying no to conservative senators voting yes. So that's how change happens, and we can accelerate it. And the other thing that I think would help accelerate it is by connecting the mental health crisis with the stress and burnout epidemic. Because the connections are very deep and real, and stress and burnout has less stigma, and yet is very much often the source of depression, anxiety.
It's the kindling.
It's the kindling, exactly. So if we can connect the two, and if we can have workplaces that are now all have kind of wellness programs, have these wellness programs go deeper and not just be about a yoga room or ear massages, but about these conversations and about fundamental workplace conditions like expectations of being always on, I think we'll be able to accelerate. So Steve and I, as the older people on the panel, will still be alive when the changes happen, right, Steve? We don't.
Speak for yourself about older people.
Becky, as the youngest person on this panel.
Yes, the only thing I would add here is I think as employers we have a responsibility and an accountability to do something different and to address the issues of mental health struggles for employees. And those don't have to be $100 million investments. I think in reality, many of the things that we've heard about today are of zero cost at all. Certainly some programs are expensive, but you don't always have to start there. More of them are about being thoughtful and innovative, and being a good listener and understanding what's going on with your employees than it is about deploying $100 million of investment to address these. So a few good examples that I'll share from SurveyMonkey that are in the category of low cost. You've certainly talked about the entry surveys or entry questionnaires or conversations with employees. Again, a low-cost opportunity to understand what's important to your people and give them an opportunity to keep those sacred in how they engage every day in their relationship with work, making sure they have time to take time off or at SurveyMonkey we offer something in addition to what we refer to as responsible PTO, where we don't really track it. We tell them to take the time that they need. We also offer a sabbatical. So every 4 years, in addition to their time off, employees can take 4 weeks of paid time. And that's refresh, recharge, energize, leave your device, take an adventure, kind of feed your soul, so that when you come back to work, you have had an opportunity to clear your air, relieve burnout, and those kinds of things. And again, in the grand scheme of things, those things are really, really low cost. Another good example at SurveyMonkey that we've done is around bereavement leave. And this was really an inspiration from Sheryl Sandberg. Our CEO, Dave Goldberg, her husband, tragically died in 2015, and she, through that process, learned a tremendous amount about grief and healing, and how you do that when you're still a mother and you have a huge area of responsibility at work. And she inspired us and is inspiring many others in our industry to take things like bereavement really seriously. So at SurveyMonkey, we extended our opportunity for employees to take advantage of paid bereavement time up to 20 days so that they can begin their healing journey after significant loss. Again, in the grand scheme of things, these things are of insequential cost to employers, but so hugely valuable to employees and how they carry on day to day after they've experienced tragedy or loss. And overall, they just make employees feel supported and like employers truly care about them. So we all have a responsibility to step up, to set a really good example in our industry, and to push one another to be more thoughtful and creative about the ways that we're looking to support employees overall.
Becky, I just want to add that you can read a very thoughtful piece by Becky and by Kelly, and a less thoughtful piece by me on our Thrive Global Mindshare Partners section, and a lot of other really fascinating pieces from contributors. And we would love over the next few weeks to have your voices there to really take the conversation to the next level. And I love what Becky said about feeding your soul. I think sometimes we forget we have a soul, and and I think it might be good to remind each other, because feeding a soul takes a lot of intangible pleasures and times away from social media and devices, and more time alone and more silence and all the things that are fast disappearing.
I was thrilled just 4 or 5 weeks ago to post on Thrive Global about mental health, and it's had a great response. I just want to finalize by saying, too, I'm impatient, like Arianna and Becky.
Even though you're so young.
That's right. Thank you so much. And but when the kids in these Let's Erase the Stigma groups do their thing, and this is the positive side of social media, they hear disclosures all the time. They don't understand why people discriminate against people with mental health issues. They convince their parents and their teachers and school administrators and community adults that we've got to change too. So it works in both directions across the generations, which I think is quite important. And back to you, Kelly.
Great. Thanks to all three of you for your amazing insights and all the fantastic work that each of you are doing in this area. I really appreciate your time today and just your work more broadly. So thank you.